All right. Okay, I think this is working. Great. So, good evening, everyone, again. And thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on Europe's proscription of Palestine solidarity. My name is Sophia Hoffinger. I'm the Monitor and Research Officer for Germany at the ELSC, and I will moderate the discussion tonight. Before we begin, so I already reminded you that we will record this event. The event will be for an hour and 15 minutes today. After our speakers have made their contributions of 10 minutes each, we will have 30 minutes for a Q&A. And please send your questions to the chat. As you're listening, we will be monitoring your questions and read the questions out loud to the speakers after their presentations. Just as a brief introduction, the ELSC was established in 2019 to defend and support the Palestine solidarity movement in Europe. This was in response to rapidly accelerating forms of repression against the movement, especially in Germany, but also elsewhere in Europe. Our work spans litigation, including defensive legal work, as well as offensive strategic litigation and working to expose and challenge complicity. Beyond our legal work, we also work on monitoring and we are involved in research initiatives. And tonight's event is an outcome of a recent research output that we produced. We also do advocacy work around Palestine solidarity in Europe. You're obviously warmly invited to follow us and engage with our work by subscribing to our newsletter or by following us on social media, and we'll post all the relevant links in the chat in a second. You can also engage with our work by, for example, joining signing a petition that we're currently running, which is a petition to call on the German federal prosecutor to investigate German government officials and CEOs for the crime of aiding and abetting genocide by producing and delivering weapons to Israel, which have been used against Palestinians in Gaza. Okay. So part of the effort of defending and supporting Palestine solidarity in Europe is about providing transnational analysis of how repression works, as we observe the overlapping realities and mechanisms of repression across varying contexts. Doing this kind of work equips us to resist and shape our legal strategies. The latest report that we just published in August this year, called Europe's Proscription of Palestine Solidarity, illustrates this overlap as the systematic nature of the use of so-called counterterrorism measures to target Palestine solidarity groups. Given our mandate and the scope of our work, we thought it only fitting to bring together insights from Palestine solidarity activists, academia, and legal practice to discuss the role proscription plays in repressing Palestine solidarity across Europe tonight. It is also central to understand proscription because of its wider effects beyond repression. On 5th of November, for example, it was reported that YouTube had taken down over 700 videos documenting Israeli human rights violations due to the US sanctions implemented against the Palestinian NGOs Al-Haq, Al-Mazan, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, all of whom had been proscribed by the Israeli government prior to the US sanctions. This shows that proscription also works to suppress crucial evidence that would support future demands of redress and accountability. So in light of all of this, we are really grateful for our speakers' time today, who we've asked to read and comment on our report. They will each speak for about 10 minutes, and we will have time for a Q&A after their contributions. Let me introduce them in order. Thomas is the legal coordinator of Urgence Palestine, or the Palestine Emergency Collective, which brings together citizens, organizations, trade unions, and political movements who are mobilizing for the self-determination of the Palestinian people. Together with Palestinian advocates, Thomas has also co-founded Nidal, a litigation-based association of the Palestinian diaspora in France. And prior to that, he worked with asylum seekers and refugees in France for 11 years. Laleh Khalili is a professor, our second speaker. Laleh Khalili is a professor at the University of Exeter and the author or editor of 7 books, including Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, and Time in the Shadows, Confinement and Counterinsurgencies. The latter explores how presumed liberal states deplore illiberal tactics and asymmetric counterinsurgency wars, often under the guise of terrorism allegations. And finally, last but not least, we have Franck Magennis, who is a barrister called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2016. Born in Dublin and raised between London and the occupied north of Ireland, He is currently instructed by Hamas to seek their removal from the list of banned terrorist organizations. He represents workers fired for criticizing Israel and Zionism against organizations like Lloyd's Bank and Arsenal Football Club. He assists lawyers, doctors, and teachers dragged in front of professional regulators for speaking out against the Zionist genocide. He has helped Palestinians and anti-Zionist Jews who fear Israeli apartheid to seek asylum in Britain. But before we give them the floor, I will hand it over to my colleague Amira, who will briefly give a summary of the key findings of our latest report, Europe's Proscription of Palestine Solidarity.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much, Sophia. I'm Amira, the Director of Research and Monitoring at the ELSC, and I just want to quickly walk you through the key findings from our report before we hand over to our wonderful speakers, and thank you so much again for making the time. So we published this report back in August, and as you all know, a lot has happened since then, both in Palestine and also here in Europe. And what really prompted the report at the time was obviously the UK's decision to prescribe Palestine Action last July. But as the report lays out, this whole trend of banning solidarity groups didn't just start this past summer. And what we found is that this crackdown in Europe is actually a systematic, pre-planned, and escalating campaign. And it definitely started well before the summer of 2025. Specifically, the report documents a really clear pattern, and we're seeing so-called counterterrorism measures being used against Palestine solidarity groups across multiple European countries, and ones that have already had bans happen, but also ones that are kind of still thinking about or in the process of banning, prescribing, or dissolving Palestine solidarity groups. And just to give you a few recent examples, back in November 2023, Germany banned the group Samidun, which is the Palestine Prisoner Solidarity Network. And the German government used something called Associations Act to dissolve them, claiming that their work, including something as simple as posting a video on social media celebrating the distribution of sweets at a demonstration in October 2023, they claimed that this was a threat. And that was the justification as to why they were banned at the time. And then also in Germany, and just last week, actually, the German Federal Ministry of the Interior also banned an association called, Sophia, you can correct my German, Muslim Interactive, I have no idea how to pronounce it. And their claim was that by denying Israel's so-called right to exist, the group's purpose is against what Germany calls the constitutional order. And the German government also claims that this group contravenes what the German state calls international understanding, which is a really vague notion. And on top of that, the ministry is also investigating two other Muslim organizations. Turning to the UK, and even before they banned Palestine Action, they prescribed Hizb ut-Tahrir back in January 2024. And actually, the Hizb ut-Tahrir case is very telling, even if it gets less attention, because Hizb ut-Tahrir had actually survived two previous attempts to ban it, once in 2005 and again in 2011. And both times, official reviews found no evidence that it was linked to terrorism, and even warned that these reviews warned that the ban would threaten free speech. But in 2024, they ignored all of this and prescribed them anyway. And that was right after they were vocally opposing genocide in Palestine. And so, as I said, our research also points to similar attempts to ban groups in other countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And so, obviously, specifically the group Urgence Palestine, which Thomas will tell us more about in a bit. And the pattern across all these countries is that governments are using these vague counterterrorism and public order laws. And this obviously also lets them bypass the normal judicial oversight and due process that you would expect. And what's really important is that this strategy consistently relies on two powerful and also false allegations. And the first of these allegations is the allegation of anti-Semitism. And this routinely conflates anti-Zionism with essentially a rejection of settler colonialism, ethno-nationalism, and white supremacy, with anti-Jewish racism. So this conflation happens between anti-Zionism and anti-Jewish racism. The second allegation, of course, is the allegation of terrorism or the support for terrorism or support for prescribed terrorist organizations. And often these two allegations, anti-Semitism and support for terrorism, come together. And both of their framings really rely on this idea of Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and also, their allies as being inherently hateful, violent, and apolitical. So in a way, we're misrepresented as just wanting to wreak havoc rather than being people with an ethical and political project aimed at liberation. And by using these allegations within these exceptionalized legal frameworks, be it counterterrorism or public order measures, the state can codify this repression. And this codification itself acts as a way to give these allegations a false sense of legitimacy. And that obviously makes it really difficult for targeted groups to defend themselves. And in the report, we also detail how these legal tools are paired with mass surveillance, essentially, and what others have referred to as a pre-criminal targeting. And so in the context of the UK, we have, for example, the PREVENT program, and it's notorious for targeting people racialized as Arab or Muslim. And through the so-called PREVENT duty, teachers, doctors, and others are, quote unquote, trained to report or to recognize and then report signs of so-called radicalization. And this has, for example, led to school children in Britain being referred to a counter-extremism unit just for saying Free Palestine in the school playground. But we also see similar surveillance programs elsewhere in Europe, right? So for instance, Germany's ban on Muslim Interactive that I mentioned earlier relied on extensive surveillance as well. And last year's domestic intelligence report in Germany even explicitly mentioned that the group's wide reach on TikTok is why they're a threat, because that wide reach in itself has allowed them to mobilize over 1,000 young Muslims for Palestine-related protests. And so again, you see this kind of link between, or this link being made between Muslimness on the one hand, extremism, and then supporting the liberation of Palestine on the other. So what's the goal of all these bans, prescriptions, the solutions, however you want to call them? The goal is to intimidate and silence, but it's also not to intimidate and silence just the activists on the front lines, but everyone in the solidarity movement. And here it's important to make a distinction. So banning a solidarity group is a real escalation that is very different from just banning a single protest or a specific action, because prescription is a bit more existential for the movement. And that's because it targets these kinds of prescriptions, bans, or dissolutions. They target the very things that allow groups to exist. So their legal recognition, their ability to have bank accounts, to meet. So it's really an attack on the enabling conditions for organized collective action. And so in essence, by banning a group, the state is telling us, if you identify with this group, if you share its beliefs or support its goals, that in itself is a crime. And essentially, that criminalizes a person's political identity and beliefs. It also creates a permanent state of suspicion because it allows for preemptive repression. And so that means police and intelligence agencies can surveil, investigate, and arrest people not for what they have done, but for what they are, or what they might do in the future based on who they're associated with. And so this is really the essence of a pre-crime space. And also, as I alluded to, prescription is really aimed at demobilizing the entire infrastructure of a movement. So suddenly it becomes illegal to, donate money, provide resources, or even provide like a meeting space, for example. The group can no longer have a public website or social media. It prevents them from organizing entirely, from recruiting. And it also does this thing where it essentially just dismantles all the knowledge, strategies, and relationships built over the years, or at least it attempts to do these things. And of course, once a group gets that terrorist or extremist label, the state justifies a massive escalation in its response, right? So as we document in Germany, for example, the ban on Salmedun in November 2023 was immediately followed by raids on 15 properties by armed police. And then also more recently, we see thousands of arrests in the UK following Palestine Action's prescription. And so that level of force is legitimized by that label of terrorism or extremism. And we also, and Thomas might tell us more about this, the state can also freeze assets of activists or those who are deemed associated with these groups even before any trial. And maybe Urgence Palestine in France can be a good example of that. And perhaps the most insidious effect is the stigma. Prescription manufactures a powerful, lasting stain. And it legitimizes also further repression in the form of, for example, smear campaigns. It taints all supporters. making everyone in the movement guilty by association, and frames the movement not as a legitimate political cause or a legitimate political project, but as an apolitical criminal and security threat. But I mean, I know this is very this paints a very dark picture, but having said all of that, I think we have to see this repression for what it is, which is that it's proof that our movement is actually effective. And I don't think that governments and powerful interests waste their time and political capital crushing movements that are irrelevant, right? So this intense crackdown is a reaction to our success. It's a response to resistance. And our solidarity is really disrupting their kind of business as usual. It's threatening profits from war, and it's exposing their. Are you trying to signal something to me? Sorry.
Yes, sorry, we lost your audio, but now we can hear you again. Sorry, can you just repeat the last sentence, please?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. I apologize. Yeah, so I was just saying that this intense crackdown is basically just our success. It reflects our success. And so when I was saying that when a state arrests someone for a Free Gaza sign, like when the police does that, and as we see on various occasions, unfortunately, the state is doing that while at the same time arming a military accused of genocide, right? So that shows you the profound hypocrisy at play here. And I think that radicalizes and has radicalized people, and it clarifies the stakes for people and shows that the state is not a neutral arbiter, but a partisan actor, protecting empire and profit over human life and justice. And that clarity has brought more and more people into the movement. And I just want to end by saying that at the ELSC and as we are part of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and we are expanding and diversifying our efforts to fight this repression that we have outlined in the report and here today. And our philosophy is embedded in what we call movement lawyering. And so that means we both use the law, subverting the law in a way, right? Subverting these measures that are used to repress us, and instead use them to defend our movement. We provide legal advice, we push for strategic litigation. But also, importantly, we work beyond the law, and we provide a more comprehensive infrastructure to fight this repression and the isolation of the movement. And our motto is that, no one is left behind. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand it over to Thomas from Urgence Palestine.
Hi everyone, thanks a lot, Amir. Thanks everyone to be here, and we are very grateful with European Legal Support Center to give us the opportunity to speak about Urgence Palestine case, but also we are very grateful about all the support we've been received from your organization since 6 months. So first, also, I'm deeply sorry for my English. I'm loyal to the French bad tradition with a foreign language. So don't hesitate to ask me or to interrupt me if you want me to repeat or find another way to express myself. So we wanted to speak here about all the threats we are facing in Urgence Palestine in France. So as you know, maybe Urgence Palestine was created in October 2023 by Palestinian community in France. And it was the first time in France Palestinians themselves succeed to organize and manage a national organization with Palestinian people in the direction of the movement. But of course, as everywhere in the West, power doesn't like people fighting the Zionist regime. Power doesn't like Arabs. Power doesn't like anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist people. So we are all of this in Urgence Palestine. So we had everything to be banned. So that's why we are here now. To begin about the threat of dissolution, in fact, it really began very quick in 2024. We saw and we heard in the media or from politics in France a new frame, a new narrative about us. As you say, Amira, it was a narrative calling us as anti-Semitic people, as Islamic people, and all the year, all the media, a lot of politics began to speak about us in this way. So yeah, after that, the dissolution process was opened on the 28th April 2025 through a letter from the Interior Ministry. But until today, we have still not received any decree. So we believe that the strength of the mobilization and the coordination with all the partners helped prevent the dissolution for now. But it can happen at any moment, and we remain exposed to this political decision. Just for the legal context in France, this possibility to dissolve association or collective is written in the French Internal Security Code, and it's an old law since 1933 law. And this text allows the government to dissolve an association or a collective. And at the beginning, this law only targeted groups taking part in armed demonstration. But Macron, with a new law, a separatist law, expanded its use, and the dissolution is now possible for incitement to violent actions against people or property. So it's easier for the power now to dissolve. And since Macron came to power, France has seen 33 dissolutions, including another Palestinian collective called Palestine vaincra, Palestine will win. And also, as you say, they dissolved also 5 Muslim associations in France with this new law in France. The decision for Palestine vaincra, Palestine will win, was confirmed by the courts. But it's important to say the judge in France confirms the dissolution not because of the action or because of the statement of the association, but because of the comments left on the social media on this collective. And that's why only this judge confirms the government decision. As for the arguments used against us, I won't go into every details, but the French government rely on Facebook posts made by some members in 2017, even though Urgence Palestine was created in 2023. And the government transformed everything. As you say before, when in the letter of dissolution we receive, it's not a decree, but it's just a letter saying maybe they will. They transform everything, and when we call for boycotts, for them it's call for armed violence. When we are posting about the need of the Intifada in Palestine, or to mondialize the Intifada in other ways, they transform it, and they call it as incitement to hate, incitement to discriminate people. And when we are speaking in the protest, where they are filming us, and where they are taking notes and intelligence. When we are speaking about the right to resist and the right to self-determination all over the Palestine, for them, it's become apology for terrorism. So yeah, the government is using the law to justify arguments coming from, as I told you, the Zionist lobby or far-right parties in France. So yeah, if the dissolution will be act on the make a decree, we face jail sentence on the fines if we continue the activity or if we create the movement. So I will just share something about the freezing of assets, because plus all this dissolution process, we are facing freezing of assets. It's not us directly, but they targeted Omar Soumi, one of Palestinian in the direction of Urgence Palestine. So he received an asset freezing measure in June. And in fact, in France, you have normally 3 ways to freeze assets. 2 are international mechanisms to follow UN or EU decision. The last one, the last way to freeze asset is fully left to the discretion of the Interior and Economy Ministry. And at this point, at this moment in June, Omar Soumi was facing no criminal charges, nothing. And yet they freeze all his assets. And beyond the personal and familial tragedy for Omar, it was also this process put also an alert inside the European banking system. And because of that, all the summer, we have been fighting with banks because they closed 5 associations bank accounts where Omar has or hasn't a link with. So it was very difficult, very long to fight with banks and to reopen new accounts. And for example, for me, with the new association for Palestinian community in France to be able to go in court, we opened it in July, and until July, it's not possible to open a new account. I already received 3 rejects just because the name of the association or what we want to do in the association. So yeah, and that's new also, but I will finish with this. Last Wednesday, police came to look for Omar Soumi also and to put him in custody during 3 days. And now he has criminal charges against him. His hearing will be on the 6th May next year on the ground of apology of terrorism. Again, it's just about what he's saying in the protest about the right to resist and the legitimacy of the right to resist in Palestine with all the way they can and they want. And it's all because of that. And we are sure in our case, it's not the first in France with this kind of charge, of course, but in our case, we are sure that the process is asked by the government with the same will to attack Urgence Palestine and the Palestinian movement in France. So it's keep going. And as we saw this week in France, the government closed also and cancelled a big conference in the Collège de France. Le Collège de France is the oldest university in France. So it was today and tomorrow a big conference with Albanese, with a lot of researchers from the US, from UK, from all the world about Palestine, about history of Palestine, and it was academic thing. It wasn't militant or activist at all, but still they cancelled it. And we lost in the Supreme Court in France today. So we have to keep fighting, and we don't have to let them the chance to go free with all of this.
Thank you so much, Thomas, also for repeating some of the allegations, because I think, Amira and I are working in the Monitor and Research Department, and we want to do more trans-European analysis, and all the allegations you've listed, like we have examples of this in Germany, in Britain, right? So these are very like we also see that like states are adopting similar approaches. Yeah, and thank you so much for also for that last bit and reaffirming why people are going to the street and are doing this work. Next, I would like to hand over to Laleh, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sophia, Amira, and other colleagues and comrades at ELSC for asking me to be here. And thank you very much to many of the audience here. I'm actually looking at some of the names of the audience, and there are activists among that audience who I have the utmost respect for. And so, in a way, I'm speaking. I feel like, in some ways, I'm speaking to the converted. As the oldest presenter here on your screen, some of the experiences right now of proscription seem to me to reflect cyclical histories of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, certainly within my lifetime, but also going back to the 1960s and 70s, for example, the strategies that a lot of the European and North American states had taken up against leftist European and North American groups that were in alliance with anti-colonial movements abroad. And again, certainly so many of the tactics that are being used right now seem to me to be a rehashing and a re-intensification of the post-September 11th terror legislation and state repression against various groups that in any way spoke against the US expanding its terror war abroad. At the heart of this process of repression is the job of classifying and recategorizing some actions as being beyond the pale. This power to reclassify or recategorize is, of course, at the heart of imperial power. And I'm going to, because I'm an academic, I'm going to quote Mahmoud Mamdani, now known as the father of Zohran Mamdani, but obviously a serious scholar of colonialism in Africa, when he describes British Empire as being about classification. He writes, they understood that to be modern was to be a master of all, and to be a master of all was to have the power to define the world, to arrange and rearrange everything in nature and in society. This hubris would ultimately lead the British to cleanse and render areas of the world as part of the larger effort to make a world as a whole. And of course, we know this was also the case in Palestine, where the US support, the British support for the Zionist movement led to the establishment of the State of Israel. Mamdani continues, not surprisingly, their first act after conquest was always to classify all plants and animals, and humans too. And dissent was reclassified as crime. Dissidents were called terrorists or criminals, going as far back as their presence in the Indian Empire, and subjected to state violence. Law in the hands of the empire was a significant instrument of classification, of this kind of classification, and placing people beyond the pale. Law as an instrument of empire, for example, saw the establishment of administrative detention legislations and regulations in all of the British Empire. And many of those administrative detention laws that the British first put in place in the mandate in Palestine have actually been absorbed and intensified in the Israeli legal corpus against Palestinians. Those same administrative detention laws were also regulations that were propagated in all of the British imperial holdings, including India and Kenya. In counterinsurgencies or counter-terrorist action abroad, the categorization of persons as terrorists allowed a legal maneuver whereby a person that was described as such was excluded from the laws of war and from even ordinary criminal policing. Basically, the description of a person overseas as a terrorist allowed for their lives to be forfeit, whether through killing or banishment or detention. At home, sympathy with terror basically cast people outside of domestic politics. It was a significant means of exclusion from politics, even where basically the political groups often demanded legitimate anti-colonial demands. Although vast anti-terrorism edifices have been built since September 11th and the United States' unending war on terror, in fact, the category of terrorism has long been used, especially by the old colonial powers of Britain and France, in their counterinsurgencies against anti-colonial struggles in Malaya, Algeria, Cyprus, Kenya, India, and Ireland. Support for movements of liberation at home, and especially by diasporas of those communities, were also subjected to enormous amounts of repression. We know of cases of injustice, whether through killings, for example, in Paris in 1960 of people demonstrating against the empire in Algeria, or the killing or the arrest and detention of people unjustly in the United Kingdom for their support for Irish independence. This has basically been a very long-standing modus operandi of various European powers. The invocation and weaponization of law in liberal and increasingly illiberal democracies is a long-standing method of political exclusion, of making untouchable groups of people, of circumscribing and dictating what forms of dissent are considered to be civil or okay and what is not. There are a whole range of tactics that imperial powers use. During the Troubles, for example, political dissent by the Republicans in Northern Ireland was criminalized. Political prisoners are even today cast as criminals here and in the US and on the continent. Proscription of anti-colonial or liberatory movements, even when they're not engaged in armed struggle here or elsewhere in Europe, is usually a means of reinforcing a system, in this case, in which Israel acts as a European gendarme in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arab world, and keeps in check any grassroots movements that may challenge Euro-American/Israeli hegemony there or here. Here, I want to shift now from what happens overseas to what happens at home here in Europe and, of course, in North America as well. And what I really want to do is I want to actually talk about the way that these systems of domestic banishment, criminalization, and proscription can be challenged. If law is a servant of politics, and it has always been a servant of politics, it is also a space of contestation. What I want to do in the next few minutes is to talk about strategies of resistance. I'm not a lawyer. Therefore, as somebody who's taught politics for the last 3 decades, I want to talk about strategies of resistance against these legal processes of proscription that don't necessarily fall within the domain of legal contest. If the states use ambiguity of status, I think in the description that both Thomas and Amira gave of some of the processes in the proscription, they mentioned vague and ambiguous and expansive definitions, terms that could be explained or re-explained however the state wanted it to, however the courts wanted them to. This is one of the tactics that they use, for example. But if that is a tactic that the state uses, we should also use that ambiguity of status and jurisdictional variation on our side as well. We are seeing, for example, instances of people using humor in order to challenge the proscription of Palestine Action here in the UK. People carrying, for example, signs that say, I do not, but the not is very small, support Palestine Action. They end up getting arrested. And I just saw a tweet somewhere that one of the people that had gotten arrested for this had received a letter that said, we're not charging you. So there is an element of using that kind of an ambiguity to clog the system, in fact. People who wear I support Palestine Action, who have been cited. Again, the clogging of the system actually, I think, is a legitimate form of resistance. As Thomas mentioned, calls for BDS are being classified as call for violence, or intifada is being redefined as armed struggle. I think it is our job to take back the meaning of these words. I think maybe it's because I am an educator, but I see my job as to constantly push actually for the historic meanings of the term intifada, and the way that it is actually does not indicate or mean the kinds of spurious valences that are being assigned to it. The strategies of resistance and political education matter. Certainly in both the US and the UK, but also elsewhere, courts are always attentive to the political context, even when they're packed with figures on the far right, as for example, the US Supreme Court is for the moment, but has always been quite a conservative body. I remember that during some of the struggles in order to get rights for some of the people that were in Guantanamo or being rendered through extraordinary rendition, some of the lawyers that were actually defending some of these accused folks would say that in their arguments in front of the different courts, both in Britain and in the US, the judges would actually tell them that the social and political pressure on the street mattered in the ways in which they listened to the court cases. So I think, again, speaking beyond the space of the law, I think it's really important to keep the pressure on in the streets. A strategy in which the public is constantly educated as to the political nature of the law would really help. This would include the very slow job of educating people. It includes building coalitions, for example, across different kinds of programs that sometimes do talk to each other, but not necessarily. So, for example, I think it would be really important for pro-Palestine activism to link hands with critics of anti-radicalization programs. I'm mentioning Prevent here, and to link up with critics of racism and policing in this country, because of course the same set of people that are using racist policing, that are using kinds of de-radicalization programs, are also the ones that are going and banning these Palestine activist organizations. These coalition building allows for the exchange of tactics, exchange of discussions, exchange of strategies, and of course the expansion of those forms of political education. I think we need to engage the unions. Some unions have been better than others in this, but given all the centrist and right-wing parties in power, given that they are all also anti-union, mobilizing unions in defense of dissent is incredibly important. So some of this work needs to be done in our chapters, in our union chapters. Artists have been crucial in reaching out to younger folks that may not be wholly politicized. I have had students that were not necessarily politically active, but the kinds of things that, for example, Kneecap or Bob Villan have done in the UK since last summer has put the issue of Palestine front and center. Some of us oldies may not necessarily think that this is actually significant, but the fact that pro-Palestine artists are packing venues also says that these are spaces in which we can reach out to younger folks. Speaking of younger folks, I think one of the things that has been brilliant in the United Kingdom has been the extent to which older folks have been mobilized in trying to fight the proscription. Some of the sit-down protests by the largely people that are even older than me, that have been holding signs that said that they support Palestine Action and have been arrested. These incredibly dignified protests have actually brought people out to these protests that have never in their lives protested before, while also tapping in to some of the older activist groups that were, that were there at Greenham Commons or that were there with CND in the 1960s. I do think that, and I'm going to quickly wrap up, I do think that also there needs to be a transgenerational conversation, and sometimes some of us older folks need to listen to some of the younger folks and their strategies of pushback, because I think that they actually have, our students and others have their own new repertoires of resistance, which I think requires updating constantly. And we need these kinds of international forums for discussion. repression, because if the NATO countries are sharing their tactics of repression, we also need to figure out how we can share tactics of resistance. So all these activities are deeply political at heart, and they require a range of mobilization, sometimes slow work and sometimes very urgent work. And we need to actually find new coalitions and think through tactics. Updating our repertoires of protest beyond the old school marches through the cities would require the ingenuity of the younger folks, the stamina of the older folks, and all of us to talk to each other. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Also for both broadening this whole debate a bit, like zooming out a bit and talking more broadly about proscription beyond Palestine solidarity, whilst also keeping it at its center. And for, this call to diversify tactics, think beyond this current moment and the longer legacy and the long durée of what we're experiencing now. Thank you so much. Following up from your call to think beyond the law, we turn now to Franck, maybe to return briefly to the law, but also probably in a critical way. So Franck, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to share the space with you all, comrades. It's a real privilege and an honor to be here. I work very closely with the European Legal Support Centre, and I have done for some years now, and I have immense admiration and respect for the work that you all do, not just bringing cases, increasing the capacity of the movement against Zionism, but also creating space like this one for us to think critically together about contributing to the successful strategy for defeating and ultimately dismantling the Zionist entity. I think the report is very useful, and I encourage people to read it. And I'm going to touch on a few different things in my contribution, but I want to start with empathy. I think that's quite important, especially on an online space like this, to try to create space for us to empathize with each other, even though we're not physically present in the same room. I've been in court today. I was in the employment tribunal representing a couple of anti-Zionist clients of mine. Some of you may have heard of their case against SOAS Students' Union. They were unfairly dismissed from those elected positions by the Students' Union, in part because of we say manifestations of their anti-Zionist beliefs. So I should say I'm coming down from all of the adrenaline of being in court, and I'm a bit frazzled. But in addition to that, since this so-called ceasefire, I've been feeling sort of perhaps guilty at the sense, or the feeling I've had. I've felt the need to sort of exhale and recover from the last 2 years, even though I know that the violence is not over. The so-called ceasefire is no ceasefire at all. The firing has not ceased. The Zionists continue to murder Palestinians, and they are merely regrouping. That's absolutely obvious. Zionism has been enacting violence against Palestinians for more than a century, long before the creation of the State of Israel. The fire has never ceased, and the violence, this horrific racist violence, will continue for as long as we allow Zionism to continue existing as a functional ideology. So that's how I'm feeling. As to what I'm going to say today, three broad headings to my contribution. Firstly, what is the extent of this crisis of Zionism, and how does that relate to our feelings of hope, our motivation as the anti-Zionist struggle for Palestinian emancipation? Secondly, the specific deprescription legislative regime in Britain, its deployment against groups both historically and currently, historically in the Irish context in particular, which is the source of those laws, and contemporarily against various groups, including Hamas, whom I represent, and Palestine Action. And then thirdly, some provocations relating to strategy in general, including some thoughts on internationalism, on the limits and the uses of legal proceedings, and in particular some thoughts on popular fronts, since a lot of people have been talking about popular fronts recently. So firstly, this crisis of Zionism and on hope and pessimism, I want to start by pointing out that it was Gramsci who famously advocates for pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And what I think he means by that is that we should be highly critical on an intellectual level. We should be ruthlessly critical of everything, as Marx put it, but we should not allow that intellectual pessimism to in any way cause inaction or despair. So on a highly pessimistic intellectual reading of our current moment, some people might argue for the position that Zionism is actually doing just fine. Iran's nuclear program was violently attacked in an unprovoked war for which Israel has faced little consequences, albeit some Iranian ballistic missiles redecorated some Israeli cities. Hezbollah has been effectively decapitated, and this one-way ceasefire has been imposed on southern Lebanon, while US and other actors try to coerce the Lebanese government into banning the armed group. And Yemen continues to face violent attacks by a coalition of Zionist allies. And it's ultimately, the Zionist entity has been allowed to commit a horrific genocide for 2 years. The precise scale of that genocide may have ebbed slightly in the wake of this so-called ceasefire, but ultimately they have thus far gotten away with it, all right? So that's the pessimistic intellectual reading of it. But I do think we have to negate that. I mean, the alternative, and I think more hopeful view, is that Zionism is in serious trouble. It is certainly in a crisis. Arrest warrants for the Prime Minister and the ICC and the ICJ proceedings have also been very useful. I'd encourage people to engage with Rob Knox's essay on strategy and tactics. He does talk about the way that bourgeois international law limits the horizon of our ambitions and what's possible, but it's necessary to have a complex view of what's happening. And it's clear that all of this activity in the ICJ is helpful and it is indicative of a crisis of Zionism. And so much for international jurisdictions. In domestic jurisdictions, which is what I'm more familiar with and which is arguably more useful, because international law and domestic law are very different, right? Domestic law is unambiguously administered by a sovereign bourgeois state. In all types of forums, Zionism is completely embattled. It is increasingly easy to go into courts, even in a country like Britain, and do serious damage to Zionism simply by stating obvious facts about it, right? Criminal case collapsed against NECAP. That was a high watermark. It made a mockery of the Terrorism Act, damaged that piece of legislation. Employment tribunal cases, riding in the wake of David Miller's judgment that established that anti-Zionism belief, philosophical belief, is worthy of protection under the Equality Act. And I understand that case was in the Employment Appeal Tribunal defending that judgment today and yesterday. So I don't think we should be complacent about the depth of the crisis. We shouldn't overstate the crisis. We should claim no easy victories, as a comrade once put it. But equally, we must channel our willpower into continuing the fight against Zionism in effective, intelligent ways. So that takes me to my second point, which is about the deprescription regime itself and groups like Palestine Action, various armed factions of the Palestinian resistance, and specifically I want to touch on the Irish context. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the history of Britain's use of the technique or the tactic of designating your political opponents illegal. I've touched on that extensively elsewhere. I am interested to learn from comrades in other jurisdictions like Germany and France, with which I'm less familiar, about how the specific legal mechanisms and tactics work in those contexts. And I was pleased to have space. I was in Berlin recently and I had a chance to speak to comrades and qualified lawyers there, like Alexandra Gorski, Nadia. And I think just swapping notes, like think what are the comrades in one jurisdiction doing? What are they going into court and saying? And how can we channel that here? Having particular regard to the fact that we're bound by various common laws, right? European law, Brexit notwithstanding, certainly the European Convention on Human Rights. So it's, as I've said, I've elsewhere spoken about the history of the use of so-called terrorism legislation in the occupied north of Ireland. And the central strategic insight I want to derive from that context is that the British Empire in the north of Ireland faced, and in some ways still faces, a very serious problem, which is that, you know, you've got Thatcher's government, for example, trying to smear as criminals the Irish Republican movement, right? These groups like the Irish National Liberation Army and the Provisional IRA, they enjoyed extremely profound popular support. They could not have operated in the way that they did if they did not enjoy, especially after 1972 and Bloody Sunday, profound support within the Irish Catholic working class community. And so the British government has the technique of trying to smear their enemies. And that's what proscription is all about. It's about trying to reconstrue anti-colonial resistance, legitimate anti-colonial resistance, as inherently criminal. So that's a very brief taste of the history. I can go into far more detail, but I've done that elsewhere. And that brings us to the present context, Palestinian context. It's in that context that I mentioned that I'm instructed. Some of you may know that I'm instructed by the Islamic Resistance Movement, or Hamas, to bring this ongoing case against the British government, which calls for them to be removed from the list of banned organizations. Mohammed El-Kurd has this expression. He challenges people, he challenges us to raise the ceiling of what's possible Another metaphor that comrades are fond of is talking about the horizon, right? We should expand the horizon of our ambitions and our strategic goals. And so my hope is that this Hamas case is an attempt to raise the ceiling of what is possible to do with and beyond legal proceedings. People who want to read the pleadings in that case, I encourage you to do it, because it makes non-abstract, our attempt at a strategic intervention. If you read what we did, the fact that we had 20 experts, the way that we formulated the legal arguments, it may provide a pretext for us to think through what we got right in that, what we're getting right in that challenge, but any mistakes that we may be making. I think we need space to have that critical dialogue. And one of the functions of terrorism legislation is to make us feel scared about even having this conversation, right? So we need to wade through that fear, face it, and cultivate courage collectively. I also want to, I'm not very good at this. I really struggle with this, but I think we need to try to think through different struggles in Europe, but certainly beyond, because if we're serious about imperialism, we have to reckon with the fact that Europe is the imperial core and Palestine is the periphery, right? And other places are in the periphery as well, like Venezuela, and the United States is ramping up violence against Venezuela. Like, we need to think through and attempt to grasp in good Marxist fashion the totality of capitalist class relations. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about the Israel lobby theory correct? And I want to reiterate that theory is simply incorrect in my view. All right, the Israel lobby theory is a liberal theory. The tail does not wag the dog, and we have to have a clear-sighted understanding of the capitalist totality. And partly that means studying other anti-colonial struggles. Algeria, Vietnam, South Africa, Ireland spring to mind, but concretely, one of the problems that I think qualified lawyers face, and I'm not putting qualified lawyers on a pedestal in many ways, Lenin's advice about how to deal with your lawyer obtains here. They're intellectualist scum who are often very unaccountable to the movement, and we should be very, very wary of lawyers. That notwithstanding, one of the problems qualified lawyers who attempt to be organic intellectuals, as Gramsci would have it, is that we don't have enough time to read theory and stay on top of all of the clients that we're representing. It's very difficult. But anytime I do get time to read about, I was reading Alistair Horn's history of the Algerian struggle. It's very, very valuable strategic insights. We have to find ways to operationalize and to Laleh's point about intergenerational conversations. We need to learn these lessons of successful anti-colonial resistance, as well as learning the mistakes. So I'm ultimately of the view that the key strategic demand for people in Britain is to build a coalition that's powerful enough to abolish the Terrorism Act. And part of that strategy involves making it unenforceable, and clearly defend our juries, and other comrades have done incredibly useful work in that regard. Third point, I'm conscious of time, I'll try and be quick. Strategy then, and some specific strategic provocations. I want to talk about, firstly, our enemies' internationalism and our own internationalism. Secondly, I want to talk about armed struggle. Thirdly, I want to talk about the uses and limits of legal proceedings. And fourthly, I want to talk about popular fronts, and then I'll say just a few words by way of conclusion. So firstly, on internationalism, I think the internationalism of our enemies is impressive. The central obvious point here is that there's an incredibly powerful strategic alliance between the United States and the Zionist entity. Cost of War project at Brown University tells us that the United States spent $17.9 billion on military aid to Israel between October 2023 and October 2024, 17.9 billion. And the WSJ report stated that US arms shipments to Israel since the start of the war included 15,000 bombs and 57,155 millimeter artillery shells, right? So that's our enemy's internationalism. They operate very effectively internationally. And capital, of course, is a global totality that sort of has dominion over the entire world. What does it mean for us to deepen our ability to operate internationally? One of the problems here, I think, that we haven't given enough thought to is the problem and the opportunity of language. What language does the international working class speak? What language does the anti-Zionist Palestinian resistance speak? Irish Republican prisoners in the north of Ireland used to speak Ask Gaeilge, used to speak in Irish, so they could talk over the heads of their prison guards. So that's why I say that language is both a problem, how do we speak to each other across language barriers, but it's also an opportunity. We can frustrate our enemies by wielding our ability to speak languages. And ultimately, I think we need to move beyond a sloganeering internationalism and towards the sort of solidarity that we saw with the Italians going on general strike, but more to the point, those military forces that have directly confronted the armed forces of the Zionist entity. And we need to ask ourselves, or we might ask ourselves, where are the international brigades, right? What would it mean for us to forge the international brigades again. Secondly, on armed struggle, the central point here is that our enemies use terrorism legislation to try to make armed struggle seem illegitimate and to practically inhibit it. Of course, they do that. Violence is the central mechanism by which settler colonialism maintains its dominion, and armed struggle is the most fundamental threat to our Zionist settler colonial enemies. So, of course, they try to make it illegal. Zionism will be defeated on the battlefield. That must be our central strategic insight. It was true of Algeria. It was true of Ireland. Thirdly, on the uses and limits of legal proceedings, my central point here is that any use of legal proceedings needs to be totally subordinate to a prior political strategy. And if you get this the wrong way round, if we get this the wrong way round, you'll have liberal lawyers smothering your political strategy with their inane tactical prognostications, right? More than that, your organization, your coalition, your group will spend your entire time fighting on enemy terrain, right? Terrain expressly designed by our enemies to advance their interests. We should fight on that terrain. I'm not an ultra leftist who says law is bad. We should absolutely fight on that terrain, but it's not our terrain, and we should plan our strategies accordingly. As someone once put it, the world is just people going into rooms and saying things. So when it is strategic to do so, we should go into those rooms that we call courtrooms, and we should find ways to say things that cause real damage to our Zionist enemies. Part of the way we do that is by thinking deeply together about the limits of law. Our bourgeois Zionist enemies write the laws. They limit the horizon of our ambitions and our imagination. I can't speak for anyone else, but when it comes to the Zionist entity, I want it to be dismantled entirely and replaced with a single state called Palestine. What the current laws really have to tell us about that strategic goal? We need to go far beyond what bourgeois law can offer. I'm conscious of time, so I may need to skip some of these points. I'll skip to the fourth point I was going to make about the popular fronts, which is perhaps the most important provocation here. I'm not going to name any names, but there's been a lot of talk recently about who should be invited into our coalition. Should we allow racist people and right-wing people into our coalition? The term popular front usually refers to a political coalition typically formed of a range of parties comprising socialists, left liberals, and communists, and united against a common opponent, historically fascism or the far right. Do we need a popular front against Zionism? Is it already emerging or re-emerging? And how does the fight against Zionism relate to other fights, such as against landlords, our bosses, against racism, and struggles for trans and queer liberation, feminism, and disability justice? There's a great scene in Ken Loach's film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which is a dramatization of the Irish anti-colonial struggle against the British Empire, in which a landlord is bringing a case against an old woman trying to drive her out of her home in the courts of the newly formed nascent Irish Republic. And a military general intervenes in the proceedings, overrides the judge, and insists that the landlord should prevail in the case. And it transpires that that landlord is sending money to the armed resistance. How are we supposed to navigate these difficult class tensions within any popular front? I don't have any firm answers, but it's an important question. Conclusions then, very quickly. I want to end by quoting the late, great Marxist comrade and intellectual Mike Davis. Writing in 2016, he said, quote, "Hope is not a scientific category, nor is it a necessary obligation in polemical writing. On the other hand, intellectual honesty is, and I try to call it as I see it, however wrong-headed my ideas and analyses may be. I manifestly do believe that we have arrived at a final conflict that will decide the survival of a large part of poor humanity over the next half century. Against this future, we must fight like the Red Army in the rubble of Stalingrad. Fight with hope, fight without hope, but fight absolutely," end quote. So as with the rubble of the war against Nazism, so in the rubble of Gaza, Zionism will be defeated on the battlefield, on the ground in Palestine. It is being defeated there. The military blows directed at it on and since October 7th have provoked a profound crisis. And the question for us outside Palestine is how to most effectively contribute to deepening that crisis so that it culminates in the destruction of the state of Israel and its replacement with a democracy. Confronting so-called terrorism legislation in Zionist allies like Britain, Germany, France is, in my view, an important front in that struggle. And in Britain, that means building the popular front that challenges and ultimately abolishes the Terrorism Act 2000 as part of a broader project to transform capitalist social relations entirely. So I encourage all comrades to keep going. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, comrades. We're going to win. Palestinians are going to win. We're going to smash Zionism, and together we must make this Zionism's final crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you ignored some of my please come to an end remarks. That was really important to hear this also at the end. We are unsurprisingly running a bit out of time. We are going to the Q&A now, which will be not half an hour as promised, but something like 15 minutes. Let me say 15 minutes, if that's okay with everybody. We have received a lot of questions from the audience, which is great. I will share all of the comments with all of our speakers, but wanted to start with two questions. One is directed to all of the panelists, and then one is directly to you, Thomas, and to Urgence Palestine. Please keep your answers relatively short, because the shorter your answers are, the more questions we can answer. The first question to all of you is, how do you think we can balance the fear of being labeled as a supporter of terrorist organizations or groups and the consequences it brings with continued support for the proscribed groups and courage to speak out? So there's a question about I'll post it also, but yeah, there's a question about the balance between kind of like fear and fear-mongering and the importance of continuing support, because we know that proscription doesn't stop at like a particular organization, right? But is a system that keeps expanding. Go ahead.
Very briefly, I think as I said, I've been finding the various tactics that people have been taking in order to stop the proscription here in the UK pretty incredible. And I think the fact that grandmas are being arrested and they're clogging the system has been astonishingly successful. Basically, this has been a campaign on the streets. It has meant that the system has been clogged up, but it has also been a media campaign. And there's something about police people lifting the bodies of elderly folks, sometimes people that are differently abled, for example, and guiding them out of there. It is quite a it's quite a powerful visual, and I think that in some ways there's also courage in numbers. This is a collective struggle, and I think that collective struggle has to be acknowledged. And finally, courage, as a US activist says, is a muscle. The more we experience, the more we exercise it, the more we build it. So I think basically I'm kind of a coward, and I find that when I am in a collective, I am much less cowardly than I would be otherwise.
Yeah, I would really echo that. I think courage is something we cultivate collectively. And you know, what is courage? It's facing your fear. It's okay to be afraid. You're allowed to be afraid of the bourgeois state. It's violent and pretty terrifying. But I think we cultivate courage collectively. And I would also say that, you know, different people have different circumstances. Some people have precarious immigration status. Some people have caring obligations. That's fine. And we should take that into account. We shouldn't homogenize. Different people are better placed or worse placed to take certain risks. The one thing I would say is that as lawyers in the movement, qualified lawyers in the movement, must not smother the militancy of their clients when people and comrades, when they come to us asking for advice on how should I navigate this legal regime. It forms no part of our function to try and dissuade people from taking militant, even illegal action, if that's what they choose to do. And if you are not able to do that, if you're not able to defy the Terrorism Act 2000, for example, there are other ways that you can contribute to the movement. There's prisoner support. There's all kinds of things short of getting arrested that you can do to contribute to the coalition that frustrates and ultimately abolishes the Terrorism Act 2000 and related, you know, similar legislation in other jurisdictions.
Thank you. Thomas, do you want to respond? There's also a question directly to you, maybe, which I will add, which also has to do with courage, or with the practice, basically, of the muscle of courage. And the question is, what is the most useful form of solidarity you are receiving from movements in France and from other countries, and what could others do better to support you?
A very big question, so I don't know. But first, I think it will be an answer for both of the questions. But one of the things we need today, with all the collective action, with all the struggle we are doing, with all the boycott academic everywhere, on the struggles on the street, etc. We have to try also to change the narrative we have to try to change the old left Zionist political party, as we call them in France, or association, because in the West, I think we have a lot of left party or human rights association. Okay, they are believing in the right of the Palestinian, but as soon as you speak about the right to resist, the right to self-determination, you lost this kind of political party, this kind of human rights association. And we saw it during the dissolution phase we were, because I was trying to coordinate all the unions, political party association in France to act, to be with them in case we have to go in court. So I tried to coordinate and to ask all of them, and yeah, few even face this kind of abuse and the violation of freedom on the association speech and stuff. They were not there. They helped us a little bit, but they didn't speak out publicly. I will be there in a legal case for Urgence Palestine, and I think it's going on now. After 2 years, so after 77 years, but I think we succeed yet now to change their mind. So the left Zionist party, it's very difficult for them now to be in the life side, in the human rights side, and to keep going with their own speech about the two-state solution, and now the Palestinian people has to stay victim but doesn't have the right to resist. So they are trying to evolve because of what we are doing, all of us here. So I think it's something we have still a lot of work on it, but I think it's also a good idea. But of course, we need, as the speech of Franck, to keep going all the struggles in the streets of Palestine with all the armed resistance, but to change the narrative in academic or left Zionist political party or association, it's a huge thing, and I think we have to work on it, and it will help us because I think they have some political way we don't have to change the repression we face. So yeah, and also beyond that, what we need in Urgence Palestine, we are working now to become in France as I told. A big Palestinian organization. That's mean with a lot of resources, a lot of legal way to resist, with a lot of branches, a lot of activities, and we need all the help we can to continue this way, this work and this development, because with a better legal team, with a better mobilization team, we will be everywhere, and it will be harder for them to come to look for us. And we will see what happens in the 6th May next year with the hearing of Omar Soumi in the charge of apology of terrorism. But I think it should be a political process, and we will change the narrative and make it a political party. Like this, it will be very difficult for them to continue to attack freely. So, yeah, what I can say.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this comment specifically, and also for reminding us that this is the importance is also about the changing the narrative. Yeah, so as I said, we've kind of run out of time, but before we end, I just wanted to read out one more comment from the chat that we got. So this comment, this comment is from Martin Shaw, who writes, "As a fellow and even older educator, I very much agree with Laleh's message. I was especially struck by her remarks about the role of classification. I want to stress that the work that I and others have been doing to enforce counter-classification against Israel, by clarifying that its campaign of destruction amounts to genocide, and indeed that its policies in Palestine have long been genocidal. This is not just a legal, but a political stance, which has long contributed to the delegitimization of Israel's actions." So I think this comment also very much links to another project that the ELSC is working on, which is we're collecting several incidents of repression also to produce a counter-narrative. In May last year, we have published an index of repression on repression in Germany. Early next year, we will expand the data set to include incidents of repression in Britain. And I also want to end this webinar by encouraging everyone to report repression if you have faced it and if you're experiencing it. I've shared the link in the chat to reach out to us in case you need legal support. And I want to thank everyone who participated in tonight's webinar for the time, for participating, for asking critical and crucial questions, and for continuing to mobilize and organize in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation. So, Amira, I will give you the last word, but yes, wanted to say thank you all.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you so much, everyone. We're 4 minutes past the allocated time, so I'm not going to take more time from you, but really appreciate all your contributions, and apologies for not getting to respond to all your comments and questions, but please, stay engaged with the ELSC, sign up to our newsletter, and again, thank you so much for all our speakers, and Free Palestine.